Welcome to Dr. Ruscio Radio, discussing the cutting edge in health, nutrition, and functional medicine. To make sure you're up to date on this and other important topics, visit drruscio.com and sign up to receive weekly updates. That's drruscio.com. The following discussion is for educational purposes only and is not intended to diagnose or treat any disease. Please do not apply any of this information without first speaking with your doctor. Now, let's head to the show.
Hey everyone, welcome to Dr. Ruscio Radio. This is Dr. Ruscio. Today I'm here with my good friend and super fit, although right now perhaps a little bit high on glue fumes, Ben Greenfield.
I'm always high on something. Yeah, right now it's glue fumes. It's hunting season up here, and you texted me while I was out in the garage making arrows. I have some screw-in inserts that you use in the carbon, and they require a decent amount of it. Pretty good glue. So yeah, I've been out huffing glue and playing with sharp things.
And the deep irony that the topic today is ways to improve cognitive function. So a real test of that.
That ought to go well.
Oh man. Well, I've been wanting to kind of dig into this topic for a while, and obviously there's a bunch of different ways that we can go. I want to pose an initial concept to you and see what you think about this. Because when I think about cognition, certainly I don't consider myself a cognition expert, but it seems that there may be two fundamental ways that we can improve cognition. One through optimizing or improving circulation, and the other through stimulation. And maybe there's other items, but do you think we can kind of organize two of the main approaches, like caffeine compared to ginkgo, stimulation compared to circulation? Do you think that's a viable way to try to partition some of these available therapeutics?
Yes, although I think there are other things that should be taken into consideration. Meaning that, for example, if you are increasing throughput via some kind of a nootropic or smart drug, but exhausting choline levels, which is an essential micronutrient for not only brain development but cognitive function, then you might experience like a post-use crash if you're using like a nootropic or a smart drug. Mm-hmm. We know that amino acids act as neurotransmitter precursors, as do, and you know this, of course, quite intimately, the gut flora. And so if either of those are dysregulated or, present in low amounts, then sometimes that can affect cognitive function as well. And that might not have much to do with circulation to the brain or, inflammation or something like that, just not enough compounds to go around.
Sure.
You could say the same thing for vitamins, right? We know the vitamin B complex is incredibly important for brain developmental process, and also to stave off some of the damage that can occur neuronally, particularly in mitochondria, when you increase neural function or neural activity. And then there are things like minerals. For example, you'll see a lot of smart drugs and nootropic compounds now including minerals like lithium, or a form of magnesium called magnesium threonate, right, which is a very bioavailable to neural tissue, or other forms of minerals. And then of course antioxidants and anti-inflammatories. Anytime you're using anything to improve cognitive function, from caffeine to nicotine to a racetam, or perhaps one could even argue some of these microdoses of psychedelics like LSD or psilocybin, anti-inflammatories and antioxidants, just from a pure neuroprotective standpoint, are really important. Not just primarily I like to look at whether or not something is able to act to quell some of the free radical formation in the electron transport chain of the mitochondria for neural function, something like PQQ or CoQ10, for example, or quercetin, but also some of the things that are more general neural anti-inflammatories, like say curcumin or DHA or green tea polyphenols. And so I think you have to paint with a little bit more broad brush if you're trying to put together a decent either supplement or food stack for the brain when it comes to covering all your bases. And that's actually one of my pet peeves, is when I see someone just like, taking Mucuna pruriens, L-DOPA precursors, like crazy to amplify dopamine levels, or, taking LSD or psilocybin microdoses every 3 days based off some psychedelic dosing schedule they've discovered, and not taking into account, not only the fact that you're a lot of times you're flooding the synaptic cleft, right, with serotonin and dopamine and a lot of these other neurotransmitters, but you're also potentially producing neural inflammation or depletion of minerals or depletion of choline, or either a depletion or an imbalance of many of these compounds that leave you worse for the wear once whatever you're using to enhance cognitive function has for lack of a better term, worn off.
Right. And those are great points, because one of the things that I'm assuming anyone who's tinkered with cognitive optimizing supplements, they may have experienced the crash. And I think many people have, like you said, they've pushed with one item, the paracetam and caffeine, or even something like fasting. People, if they do too much fasting, they can feel great during, and then they crash. And so looking at this through the lens of maybe some stacks in terms of you can take X, but make sure you take Y and Z along with it. Mm-hmm. Definitely want to deeply dig into that in a moment, but just a gloss over some of the basics for people. Make sure you're getting enough sleep. Make sure that you're exercising. Fasting is also something to consider, and both exercise and fasting can enhance both circulation to the brain and this brain-derived neurotrophic factor, and also mitochondrial function. Carb intake, and Ben, I'm really curious to get your thoughts on this one. Carb intake, in my estimation, is very individual. Some people really tend to cognitively thrive on more of a lower carb or even a ketogenic type approach, and then other people, they will just have this incessant fatigue and brain fog because they're not getting enough carbs for the metabolism. So what are your thoughts on carbs in terms of, do you find that same kind of personalized need to dial in the carb intake for optimum neural output?
Well, sure. Two things there. The first is just rewinding or backpedaling just a touch to what you were recommending from a lifestyle recommendation standpoint, which is sound advice, right? Sleep, exercise, attention to one's personal environment. But I would encourage folks, and I always say this before anyone turns to a smart drug or a nootropic stack or any of these exogenous compounds, to indeed take an even deeper dive into some of those things that you mentioned. For example, air in the home, right? We know that mold and fungi and airborne pollutants and volatile organic compounds and off-gassing, all of these can drastically affect cognitive function during the day, whether at your home or your office, and they should not be discounted. The quality of the air that you breathe, the installation, in my own home, I have a centrally installed HEPA air filter that also, blasts the air with UV radiation. And I have a few standalone HEPA units in our daylight basement simply because I know it being a daylight basement, it's a little bit more prone to moisture and to the potential for buildup of something like mold. And there's also carpet downstairs, right? So I have HEPA air filters downstairs, and we have lots of plants in the home as well, which act as natural bioremediants for the air. So you want to pay attention to that. We know that flicker from modern LED and artificial lighting can affect cognitive function. And in addition to that, many of these cans, especially the ones that run on AC currents, they generate a lot of dirty electricity. And, you certainly see more and more data now coming out about the link between EMF exposure and neural function. And so attention paid to the type of lighting that you use in your home, such as using, one of my top recommendations, just get old school style, clear incandescent bulbs in most of the rooms of the house. And then something like a near infrared light bulb, the same as you would use in like a reptile cage, in the bedroom or in the areas of the house where you'd want to sleep, where you want a little bit more red light and absence of blue light. And when it comes to light, there's even a lot of data now about activation of some of the C oxidase in mitochondria via the use of near infrared or red, using photobiomodulation, using things like infrared sauna, which, by the way, is also fantastic for BDNF, which you alluded to, that brain-derived neurotrophic factor. The same thing that gets activated through fasting and through aerobic exercise. So paying attention to the absence of bad light and the presence of good light, right? Sunlight is, of course, the most natural way to get plenty of near and far infrared light in a full spectrum, but the use of some of these devices that can, there's one called a Vielight I was just showing this morning to one of my friends who has some post TBI issues, and this is just photobiomodulation for the head. other lifestyle factors in addition to air and light that you'd want to consider would be, as I just kind of touched on, your exposure to Wi-Fi routers, Bluetooth, dirty electricity, whether or not you'd like to admit that there's much research behind those. Even just anecdotally, I've seen so many people have better function, especially in the afternoon as you get towards the end of the workday, by doing simple things, right? Like plugging an Ethernet cable from your laptop into the router rather than using the Wi-Fi signal, keeping the phone in airplane mode if you're not using it, installing one of these like glare blocking type of devices on the screens that you're operating on during the day. Like I like this one called Iris Tech, which reduces not only the blue light like Flux does, which is a popular one, but also reduces flicker and glare and some of these other parameters that can affect neural function. And then finally, before I get to your carbohydrate question, there's this concept that you briefly alluded to of exercise and fasting, right? Two very potent ways to increase what, in layperson's terms is miracle grow for the brain, right? BDNF, that's elevated via intermittent fasting. It's also elevated via, like I mentioned earlier, infrared sauna, and it's also elevated via primarily aerobic or endurance exercise. And so those are other things that you should include from a lifestyle standpoint before you start to, let's say, fill your cupboard with a bunch of these spendy nootropics and smart drugs. Now, as far as carbohydrate is concerned, I can't say I've seen a lot of data on carbohydrates and neural function. Although I can say that just from a pure metabolic health standpoint, when we look at insulin, diabetic type 2 risk, your HOMA-IR scores, your blood glucose values, hemoglobin A1C, there is a drastic difference in the way that certain people respond to carbohydrate intake. And that's based on everything from genetic factors like salivary amylase production and pancreatic beta insulin output to digestive function, such as whether or not, and I know this is something that you're well aware of, Michael, is, whether or not someone is prone to fermentation or, has some kind of overgrowth for which, carbohydrates can affect the gut-brain connection just based off fermentation and bloating and all these other things that tend to distract one from being able to cognitively function, or even can influence things like neurotransmitter formation, based on bacteria in the gut and that gut-brain axis. And then, of course, there are people who need to adjust their carbohydrate intake just based purely on activity levels, right? Like, hard charging athlete can often stay in, let's say, ketosis, which is a pretty good neural hack, just fine on 100 to 200 grams of carbohydrates every day. Whereas the person who's turning to ketosis or carbohydrate restriction for medical reasons and who's not like an exercise enthusiast may need to eat 30 to 40 grams per day. So it widely varies based on your genetic potential, particularly regarding insulin and amylase, regarding your gut health, especially presence or absence of certain things that would tend to ferment, whether it's SIBO or yeast or fungus or candida or whatever, and also your activity levels. So there's a lot to be taken into consideration when it comes to carbohydrates, and that's just a whole different can of worms we could probably spend hours talking about. But yeah, you do need to customize your carb intake based on some of those factors.
All right. Well, great lead in there, and or I should say, great iteration of the foundational factors. And for people listening to the podcast, yes, don't gloss over your sleep and your air or water quality as examples, and then jump right to some sort of supplement stack. Because in my experience, if you don't have the foundation in place, then you're really going to be just wasting your money on these supplements.
Right.
And Ben, what was the name of that light app again? The one besides Flux? I'd like to try a new one. So
yeah, there's I think he's Romanian, the Romanian program named Daniel Horhev, and he has some really good software he's designed called Iris, IRIS. I've interviewed him on my podcast, and it's an interesting show because we not only discuss the type of software you can install, but also monitor choice. And so what I use now as a monitor, the one I have now is made by a company called IZO, EIZO. It's a flex scan, and I can switch it to paper mode, just like paper mode on a Kindle. So I've got a whole bunch of stuff to read, and I don't want to burn my eyeballs out, especially because I like to read research articles and certain things that just don't arrive in paper to my house could switch the screen to paper mode for my more intensive reading, which I often do, in the evening before dinner. I'll slip down into the office and I don't have any lights on in the office and just that one monitor is on, and I still wear, blue light blocking glasses and whatnot. But yeah, the software is called Iris Tech, and the monitor I use right now is the Flex Scan monitor made by ISO.
Nice. I didn't realize there was a monitor like that. That would actually be fantastic, because one of the things that I get so sick of is just being in front of a computer screen. I feel like my life is lived in front of a computer screen. So cool. Let's talk about one of my favorite tests for digestive health, the GI map from Diagnostic Solutions, who has helped to make this podcast possible. Now, if you've been reading any of the case studies that I've published in the Future of Functional Medicine Review clinical newsletter, you've likely seen that this test, the GI map, is a test I frequently use in my practice. Why? Well, one of my favorite things about this test is it has excellent insurance coverage. So this is a few $100s I save patients. This lab is also CLIA certified, which is essentially the Quality Assurance Bureau for labs. So it's important that these labs are being monitored, not cutting any corners. That's where you get your CLIA certification. Now, this test uses quantitative PCR technology, so it's a DNA test, and you'll get a good read on dysbiosis with this test because they will assess and report out various types of bacteria, yeast, and parasites, including protozoa, worms, and amoebas. They also have some valuable and helpful clinical markers like calprotectin, which can help rule in or out inflammatory bowel disease, and zonulin, a marker of leaky gut. So head over to diagnosticsolutionsLab.com, diagnosticsolutionsLab.com to learn more and to order your test. And just to touch on another point that you made, and John Kaiser, I thought, said this fairly succinctly. He was if you remember back, audience, he was the mitochondrial researcher we had on a number of months ago. He said healthy mitochondria, which are very important for neurological function, amongst other things, they need clean air, clean food, and clean water. And so that's kind of the part of the foundation that we're laying here. And then also things like exercise and fasting can help to stimulate mitochondria. And I guess you could add to that, and this is something I actually took away a deeper appreciation for, Ben, with my recent conversation with Mercola, and then with your podcast with Dr. Mercola about the deleterious impact that EMFs can have on mitochondria, which is something I found to be really interesting.
Yeah, clean air, clean food, clean water, all of those can influence the electron transport chain. And what you wouldn't want to do, and you'll see a lot of folks doing this, is simply consume anti-inflammatories willy-nilly or antioxidants willy-nilly, thinking that they're actually going to be beneficial for the mitochondria, when in fact you do need to be careful. We know high doses of synthetic antioxidants like vitamin C and vitamin E might not be as good as other antioxidants that have been shown to be able to quell excess free radical buildup in tissue without necessarily interfering with the necessity of free radical signaling in the mitochondria, because free radicals are, that's one of the primary ways, in addition to neurotransmitters and hormones, in addition to just basic nerve signaling, electric transmission, and in addition to, if we really want to take a little bit more of a geeked out dive into biophotonic energy, right? Cells actually can use light to communicate. Well, one of the other ways that cells communicate is via free radicals. The presence or absence of free radicals is how the mitochondria know to increase or decrease activity in the electron transport chain. And so if we just completely blunt free radical formation all the time, then you actually can see dysregulation in terms of everything from mitochondrial energy production to mitochondrial density to natural apoptosis versus the absence of that. And so when you look at the topic at hand, neural function, I briefly alluded to, for example, PQQ or coenzyme Q10. Both of those have been shown to have profound improvements in the health of the mitochondria and in neural function without actually limiting free radical signaling. So those would be two that I would consider to be as good things to include with any type of, there are obviously things like Alpha Brain and CILTEP and Qualia and, all these different nootropic stacks out there. Well, I think that if they don't have these type of antioxidants like PQQ and CoQ10 built in, that you should add things like those. Another one that's very important for the mitochondria, based on the fact that, especially in people who think a lot and people who exercise a lot, or people like me who both exercise and think a lot, you see ATP reduction and ATP depletion as being a pretty big issue when it comes to mitochondria specifically. And you can supplement with a type of low glycemic sugar, speaking of carbohydrate, that can actually increase bioavailable pools of ATP in a similar way that creatine, which is also a nootropic, increases levels of phosphagen without necessarily having to eat a whole bunch of extra calories. And that's D-ribose. Yeah. D-ribose, daily supplementation with D-ribose is another really good one, especially for active people who want enhanced neural function. And a D-ribose creatine stack, like throwing that into the smoothie in the morning, a lot of people will see a big pick-me-up from that, regardless of what type of nootropic or smart drug stack that they're using. And then just a few others that I briefly mentioned that should just be part of anyone's diet, in my opinion, anyways, would be some form of DHA, whether that's L-Joel or fish-based. Some type of green tea polyphenol. Green tea just has a whole bunch of benefits, especially for people who consume caffeine due to its L-theanine content, which can kind of limit some of the sleep disrupting properties of caffeine. But also,
and so just drinking green tea, would that be enough, or would you say you need some sort of supplement?
I mean, really, for the whole like better living through science supplementation effect, you want to get close to like 500 milligrams of EGCG, and that's a lot of green tea. Mm-hmm. So if you can get it in a supplement form, all the better. But I mean, if you want to go more natural and just drink green tea during the day, that's another option.
What's a good supplement there that you like for people?
There's a few different like green powders that you can use that have pretty high amounts of EGCG. One that I've been using recently, Dr. Jason Fung, who wrote that Complete Guide to Fasting book, he worked with a company, I forget their name. If you were to Google like Jason Fung green tea, you'd probably find it. But they're doing like these little green tea packets that they're advertising as fasting tea because it seems to do a pretty good job at quelling the appetite. But I've literally just been taking a couple of packets of those on occasion throughout the day, just dumping them in my mouth, not even bothering to mix with hot water or cold water or anything, and just kind of taking the lazy man's route and mainlining it into my lingual membranes. But yeah, green tea, and then another one, or it's kind of, I guess, more like a 1-2 stack that has some really potent neural anti-inflammatory effect without necessarily deleteriously affecting free radical production, would be something that's kind of a classic combo nowadays in the supplement industry, and that's curcumin blended with some form of black pepper like bioperine. And you'll actually find that in some nootropic blends these days. And you can, of course, go old school, just like you can drink green tea. You can make your smoothie and drop some turmeric root and some black pepper pods in there, or you can, buy yourself a curcumin supplement and a bioperine supplement, or, a good form of curcumin that's blended with bioperine or black pepper extract. And, everything that I've just named has really good research behind it, particularly regarding the neural anti-inflammatory potential. So those would be compounds you would want to include on a regular basis to address neural inflammation, again, regardless of what type of smart drug or nootropic that you're using.
Now, Kaiser felt that CoQ10, N-acetylcysteine, alpha-lipoic acid, and acetyl-L-carnitine were four of the most important nutrients for mitochondrial health. Yeah. Do you have any quarrel with those for any reason?
No. The N-acetylcysteine and the what was the second one you said?
CoQ10, N-acetylcysteine, alpha-lipoic acid, and acetyl.
ALA and NAC. Both of those do have good research behind them. The mechanism of action isn't necessarily anti-inflammation for N-acetylcysteine and alpha-lipoic acid. Neither is it for L-carnitine. Most of those are going to act by upregulating the shuttling of free fatty acids into the Krebs cycle, for example, or amplifying mitochondrial energy output. That other one that you mentioned, the CoQ10, that can act as a mitochondrial antioxidant or anti-inflammatory. So it kind of falls into the category of what I was just talking about. But yeah, I would say that there are a few others I would definitely include in that stack. PQQ would be one. that D-ribose that I mentioned, especially if you're an active person. I would say that would be another must. And then, as I alluded to a little bit ago, I think a B vitamin complex is pretty important as well. Yeah, that would cover a lot of your bases from a mitochondrial standpoint. And I should mention a really good, somewhat recent book that I think everyone should read if they want to better understand mitochondria, and especially this idea of free radical signaling that I talked about, is Lee No's book, Mitochondria and the Future of Medicine. That's a great book for learning a little bit more about how some of these compounds interact with mitochondria.
And it's what his name was, Lee? No?
K-N-O-W.
Gotcha. Lee No. Has he been on your podcast also?
No, I probably will interview him at some point. I've got my much to the chagrin of my wife, my office is increasingly stacked with books earmarked with people I need to interview that I haven't gotten around to interviewing yet. So yeah, I need to build a little outhouse for my books or something.
Yeah, no, I know the feeling. So these are all supplements that I think are highly advisable in the sense that they seem to have reparative, anti-inflammatory benefits, and I think these are good, solid nutritional type supports. When someone's confronted with some of these other options that might be more stimulants, I'm curious what you think about things like these smart drugs, and if you could comment also before we touch that briefly on things like ginkgo. Are there any other of these popular supplements for cognition that you think are worthwhile? I know there's some research on ginkgo. I believe it's predominantly performed in aging populations. Part of the mechanisms might be, or the predominant mechanism appears to be, I believe anyway, through enhancing circulation. What else?
Ginkgo is an interesting one. I mean, it's actually taken from a tree, and that would fall into the category of more of a Chinese supplement. A lot of these nootropics come from either Chinese medicine or traditional Ayurvedic medicine. So ginkgo has a whole bunch of different flavonoids in it, and there's some pretty good rodent models that show that those can improve antioxidant activity, and there are human models that show that it can increase cognitive performance. So ginkgo would fall into the category of a nootropic, right? A lot of times these herbs, these natural, non-synthetic, non-laboratory created compounds, they fall into the category of nootropics, and many of them work. And some of them, like yerba mate, for example, that works for a lot of people. For me, it gives me jitters. And so, sometimes you have to use yourself as an N=1. But I would say that some of the more well-researched nootropics that would not be considered a synthetic smart drug, that I think ultimately, for reasons I'll hopefully get to in just a moment, would be safer than a smart drug. One would be Bacopa. Bacopa would fall into more of that like Ayurvedic type of category. That one has some really good research behind it, especially for memory. Ginkgo is another good one, similar to Bacopa, particularly for memory, but it also works well for overall executive function, lucid dreaming, a whole bunch of different effects. It's also known as the intellect tree. I recently wrote an article on it over on my website. It's called Celastrus, and that one's also a nootropic. That one I like, and that's something also that I have around. Yerba mate I mentioned, and caffeine, of course, most everyone is aware of, so I don't need to kick the coffee or the green tea horse to death. And then one other that I'd mention as far as just like more of a natural nootropic would be maca. Maca root actually has some good research behind it in terms of its cognitive and memory enhancing effects, and it's also great for sexual function as well. So those would be a few of the more natural nootropics, and technically some of these racetams, they also fall into the nootropic category because they act very similar to a nootropic, like a piracetam or an aniracetam, and some of those seem to be a little bit more safe than, even though they can be synthetically derived, than some of these other smart drugs that act a little bit more harshly on the central nervous system. And I'll fill you in on a few of those in a second, but I would be remiss not to name one other that's kind of like a darling of mine when it comes to like cognitive performance. That would just be nicotine. 9 times out of 10, if you see me and I'm just like smoking along through an article or, trying to get through a whole bunch of books or something, for me, I've just got a cup of black coffee and a nicotine toothpick. Like that's kind of my very simple go-to. And I think part of it is just because I kind of feel like an old schooly writer who's drinking a cup of coffee and smoking a cigarette without all the carcinogens of a cigarette. And there's just like, it's almost like comfort foodie for me. Like if you find me down in my office working during the morning, there's like a cup of black coffee and a little nicotine toothpick. And that's kind of, and it's cheap compared to all these expensive nootropic herbs and everything. And it just works for me. So nicotine and caffeine is actually a pretty good stack. And some of those other nootropics that I mentioned are great to have around in the pantry or the cupboard and kind of see how you respond to them. And they're relatively safe. Most of those that I mentioned, like ginkgo or Salestris or Bacopa. But when you look at some of these others that you talked about, technically, most of them fall into the class of ampakines. Some of them are also known as monoamine oxidase inhibitors or MAO inhibitors, like Deprenyl would be an example of that. Deprenyl is a very popular one that is efficacious, but I think relatively harsh on the central nervous system, like many of these others. Some of the more popular ones would be like methylphenidate or Ritalin. Commonly prescribed for ADD or ADHD. And that, most of these, the reason I don't like them is they intensively flood the synaptic cleft with dopamine, or with norepinephrine, or in some cases with serotonin. And again, you're causing a premature exhaustion of neurotransmitters, or you're developing an insensitivity or a need for a higher and higher amount of dopamine receptors or other receptors. And it's one of those quick fixes that I think is a biological shortcut that creates long-term issues. Modafinil would also fall into the category of being an ampakine. And that one also, in my opinion, again, very similar to even like LSD and psilocybin. Long-term extended use, especially in higher doses, can lead to some pretty significant dopamine imbalances or dopamine resistance or lowered sensitivity to dopamine. And you'll find a lot of people who overuse a lot of these things, it's like they don't feel that great or that happy unless they're on them. And that's related to those dopamine issues. Amphetamines like Adderall, that would also fall into kind of like that psychostimulant category. That one, it's a little bit more norepinephrine and serotonin related. And interestingly, many of these are used, or derivatives of them are used as Alzheimer's drugs because they can block the uptake of glutamate. And that can minimize the effects of conditions like Alzheimer's. But anytime you're completely blocking the effect of any excitatory neurotransmitter, you can create some amount of dependency or a need for more receptors, or again, a need for higher and higher amounts of dopamine and serotonin or norepinephrine to actually feel good. So these are playing with fire. I have in my pantry modafinil. And I use it about once a month, typically when I'm in a very sleep deprived state. Either something has happened, like shit has hit the fan some night and I got to stay up till 4 a.m. fixing something that's wrong with a website or an order mechanism, or somebody dropped the ball on an article and I got to like churn out an article between midnight and 5 a.m. Right. And then I have to function the entire next day. Or occasionally I'll fly internationally to speak at an event, and I'll literally just like fly, hit the ground running, got to squeeze in a workout, go speak, and completely just give the middle finger to sleep. But I will not claim that those are helpful at all. Yeah, I mean, modafinil is a freaking narcolepsy drug, right? Like it'll keep you awake through just about anything you need to stay awake for, and in addition to that, it will allow you to punish through some pretty cognitively demanding work during that time. But it's just like the fairy tale. I forget the name of the fairy tale where the person has the ability to like pull this little string and press the fast forward button on life whenever things get uncomfortable or they need to just find an escape. And before they know it, they're like old and decrepit and they haven't had a chance to live life. And they've pulled that biological shortcut too much. So my approach is a little bit of caffeine, a little bit of nicotine. Some of these natural nootropic supplements, when I have more cognitively demanding days, like right now I use one called Qualia Mind is the one that I like, that I feel pretty good on, that still allows me to, if I take it at say 6:30 a.m. when I get up, I can still like have my nice little afternoon nap that I love, sometime around 2:30 or 3 or whatever. And then very occasional use of these more like big gun type of nootropics, or smart drugs, really, like that modafinil I talked about. But we're talking like once a month. Occasional use of psychostimulants that would be considered psychedelics. This would mean like maybe once a month. Again, that little of use now. Before like a really cool, fun hike, I'll take a microdose of psilocybin. And I'm not writing fiction right now, but I did a lot more when I wrote fiction because it does a good job merging left and right hemispheres of the brain. So you can organize all your characters and lands and stories and all the parts of fiction that require the left brain, but then also delve into more of the right brain creative thinking.
Does THC have any kind of similar effect in that vein? Do you know?
Well, for what I was just talking about, I use LSD, microdoses of LSD. Mm-hmm. THC
or cannabis for the audience.
The endocannabinoid system, when used as a smart drug or a nootropic, I haven't found to be that efficacious. Like THC will induce creativity, sure, but it's not that productive creativity, right? I think THC is like good for a concert, for maybe strumming away on a musical instrument, that type of thing. But compared to, when we're talking about actually being an enormously productive member of society, I mean, something like a microdose of LSD would beat THC hands down, even when it comes to the creativity aspects. CBD, that would be more of like a stress decreaser that you could argue would indirectly improve your focus or cognition if you just were less stressed. But I haven't found CBD, even when sold as a part of these different nootropic compounds, which it's now included in and combined with caffeine and things. I find CBD just, induces kind of like the L-theanine in green tea, right? Like a little bit of a mild relaxing effect, which may have some indirect cognitive enhancing effects. But yeah, ultimately for me, it's very occasional uses of a microdose of a psychedelic substance in small amounts, very occasional use of a smart drug that would be considered like an amphetamine or central nervous system stimulant. And then caffeine and nicotine pretty frequently these days. And then that quality of mind stuff 3 or 4 days a week max. And then just, as coming full circle, close attention to my personal environment, air, light, water, electricity, movement, good food. And that's my strategy, man.
Hey everyone, this is Dr. Ruscio. I quickly wanted to fill you in on the 3 main resources that are available to you in case you need help or would like to learn more. Of course, I see patients both via telemedicine, via Skype, and also at my physical practice in Walnut Creek, California. There is, of course, my book, Healthy Gut, Healthy You, which gives you what I think is one of the best self-help protocols for optimizing your gut health and, of course, understanding why your gut is so important and so massively impactful on your overall health. And then finally, if you're a clinician trying to learn more about my functional medicine approach, there is the Future of Functional Medicine Review, which is a monthly newsletter, which is a training tool to help sharpen clinical skills. All of the information for all 3 of these is available at the URL drruscio.com/resources. And in case you're on the go, that link is available in the description on all of your podcast players. Okay, back to the show. And with some of the brain boosting nutrition like the CoQ10 and PQQ, are you using those more of a long-term kind of foundational supplement that you're not kind of pulsing?
Yes, I'm so impressed with the data I've seen on those for mitochondrial health that I use them pretty frequently. And right now I'm kind of agnostic on brands. I believe what I have right now is the Alms Bio glutathione, which is a liposomal glutathione taken sublingually that has several different mitochondrial antioxidants or mitochondrial support in it, in addition to glutathione. I like anything like that. That's kind of like a shotgun supplement that takes care of a few things all at once for me. And then there's another one made by Quicksilver Scientific and Dr. Chris Shade over there called, I think it's just called The One. And it's got a whole bunch of pretty good little mitochondrial support compounds in it as well. So those are a couple of ways that I'm kind of mainlining some of like the PQQ and the CoQ10 into my system. And then for D-ribose, I help companies sometimes develop supplements, and I'm currently helping a supplement company develop a sleep supplement that actually has D-ribose and creatine in it, kind of for athletes. And then there's a whole bunch of other kind of nighttime recovery and sleep compounds in there. But right now, that's how I'm getting D-ribose and creatine, is just drinking the god-awful batches of powder they're sending to me as we get the flavor profile dialed in.
Nice.
But yeah, so I'm, a lot of times just for me being in the supplement industry or being a nutritionist and having all these relationships in the industry, a lot of times I just have so many kind of different brands hanging around the house. Again, I'm kind of brand agnostic. Obviously, I own my own supplement company at Keon, but we don't necessarily have right now some kind of like a mitochondrial support formula. So I use other brands for that.
Yeah, I mean, I'd like to tell people that as long as you're using a company that I think looking for a company that follows good manufacturing practices or GMP, and it's just a credible, well-known company that, I don't get overly wrapped up in this is the newest, best form of this vitamin, and we've got it, sometimes that is true, yes. But usually you're seeing the best offerings fairly standard across some of the top tier supplement companies. And, I caution people not to get overly wrapped up into, there's always a bell and whistle that one company is trying to use to distinguish itself over another, which is fine.
Yeah.
But just don't let it stress you out and make you think that, there's only one form of ribose.
I agree. And admittedly, I got to go pretty soon, but I would say that, my approach is I look like you do for CGMP. If it is NSF certified for sport or TGE certified for sport, for me, still competing as a pro athlete and still getting urine tested and all that jazz, that's important to me just for peace of mind. And then the last thing I really look for, in addition, just ensuring, because I look at the research and make sure the delivery mechanism isn't a waste of my time. But ultimately, I look for things that are a shotgun formula, that can just cover kill a lot of birds with one stone, right? Like the Thorne multivitamin or that glutathione supplement that I mentioned, or like the Qualia Mind as a nootropic that has the minerals and the anti-inflammatories and then the racetams and stuff in it, or my own company has one called Keon Flex, which is just like everything that you'd ever want for joint support in one formula. I try to choose things that kill as many birds with one stone as possible, just because, let's face it, a lot of these encapsulated delivery mechanisms, they still have magnesium stearate and capsular coatings and all. The fewer capsules I can pop on any given day, the better. So I just like to look for stuff that covers as many bases as possible. So in addition to quality and in addition to it being something I can consciously or with good conscious take as an athlete, I just look for stuff that gives me as much as possible in one dose.
Gotcha. Yeah, it makes sense, man. Well, hey, I know you got to run, but thanks for taking the time to jump in on this and talk about brain support. And you seem to do pretty well, despite being a little bit glue high. And is there anywhere you want to point people, a website, book, anything like that?
Maybe we discovered a new nootropic, glue.
Yeah, right. Glue. The 4-year-old kids were right.
Yeah, I would just say, if you want to link to anything in the show notes, just like my blog, or people could Google Ben Greenfield. And again, I designed some supplements and those are on my website, Keon, just getkion.com, getkeon.com. Try to put a newsletter every week. And that's it. And I guess the last thing I would say, if folks are listening in, not to brown nose or anything or blow smoke, but if you haven't read Michael's book, the Healthy Gut, Healthy You book, I find myself with increasing frequency recommending that book to everyone from like the personal trainers I work with or working with clients to, my own clients, to just like folks who have gut issues. It's kind of like I just tell people, I could tell you all this stuff, but just go buy Michael's book. So yeah, awesome. There's a plug for your book, dude. I do dig it. So thanks for writing that.
Thanks, brother. I appreciate it. Cool. Well, thank you again, my man. Go fire some arrows off, and hopefully we'll chat soon.
All right. Later, dude.
Be good.
Thank you for listening to Dr. Ruscio Radio today. Check us out on iTunes and leave a review. Visit drruscio.com to ask a question for an upcoming podcast, post comments for today's show, and sign up to receive weekly updates. That's drruscio.com.